Hello and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by RenewableEnergyWorld.com. Today's event, GWEC presents Webcast on Wind, Doing Business in the United States, will be presented by Steve Sawyer, Secretary General, GWEC, and John Hensley, Manager, Industry Data and Analysis, AWEA. Before we begin, I want to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application widgets you can use. If you have any questions during the webcast, you can click on the Q&A widget and submit your question. This box has already been opened for you, and you'll find it underneath the speaker module. We will try to answer these questions during the live Q&A portion at the end of the webcast. PDFs of today's presentation will be available in the on-demand version, and once you come in for the on-demand, you will see it under that green resource list widget. You can expand the slide area by clicking on the maximize icon on the top right of the slide area or by dragging the bottom right corner to enlarge. In fact, you can expand and reposition many of the components on your screen, so please feel free to arrange as you desire to give you the best webcast viewing experience. If you have any technical difficulties during the webcast, please click on the Help widget. It has a question mark icon and addresses the most common technical issues. If you still need assistance, just type your question or your issue into the Q&A widget, and a member of our webcast support team will work with you to correct the problem. For your convenience, this presentation will be available for on-demand viewing within 24 hours of this live event. A reminder message will be sent to all registrants with a link to the archive. It can also be reached from our homepage at RenewableEnergyWorld.com. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Steve Sawyer.
Thanks, Tammy. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Steve Sawyer from the Global Wind Energy Council, and I'm going to give a brief introduction outlining some of the findings in our annual report, which was released a couple of weeks ago in terms of the status of the global industry, and then turn it over to my colleague John Hensley from the American Wind Energy Association to go more in depth on the U.S. So without further ado, just let me say briefly that GWEC is a global trade association representing both major companies and national and regional associations in the sector, including, of course, the American Wind Energy Association and the list of other entities that you see there on your slide. I'm going to talk very briefly today about the following subjects. 2015 markets primarily, a little bit about our projections going forward, both in the medium and the longer term, and then some of the new markets we're looking at, and then wrap it up very quickly. Last year was an excellent year for the industry. Sorry, I went too far. Here we go. Yep, there's the global cumulative installed capacities for the last 15 years. And you can see that we passed 400 gigawatts last year and ended up the year with almost 433, which represents a growth of about 17% in cumulative terms on the previous year's market. Looking at the annual numbers, you see a much more complex story with those bumps and ups and downs, largely as a result of vagaries of the U.S. Congress, but not only, because, of course, the period from 2009 to 2013 was essentially us feeling the after effects of the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, where we had essentially flat markets. If you take those 5 years and average them across, you get to about 40 gigawatts a year, but then last year in 2014 grew to over 50 gigawatts, and then this year to over 60 gigawatts, ending up the year with 63.5 gigawatts installed globally. So another year of good growth, much to many of our surprise, 22% all told. If you look at how that plays out in terms of the top 10, in terms of cumulative capacity, nothing much has changed really. Except for the fact that India surpassed Spain in 2015 to move in fourth place on the global rankings in terms of cumulative capacity, with China having just over a third of the total global market share. If you look at that in terms of the annual, annual markets, then you have, again, pretty much the same ranking as last year. except of course that the U.S. Moved back into second place, where it is most of the time behind China. The big story, of course, being the fact that China installed 30 gigawatts in total capacity in 2015, but the U.S. having a much stronger than expected year, as did Germany, which set a new record, breaking 6 gigawatts for the first time, and just over 2 gigawatts of that was offshore. The rest of the rankings remained very similar to last year, although I think we have Turkey on the list of top 10 for the first time. If you look at how that breaks out regionally, we have 3 main markets. They used to be roughly equally balanced in the sense that Asia, North America, and Europe were the main ones, although now we see, of course, that for the last 4 or 5 years, Asia has surged way ahead, and now accounts for something like half, or a little bit over half last year, of the global market. And Latin America, which in our statistics, Mexico is not considered as part of Latin America. It's considered part of North America, which North America, you can see, is the most volatile region. And in a few minutes, John's going to tell us about how that's not going to be the case anymore, we hope. If you're looking then at the offshore market, again, the big surprise last year was Germany, with more than 2 gigawatts installed, led all global markets in 2015. The UK is still the total leader in cumulative capacity, with just over 5,000 megawatts in the water. The Netherlands and China were the others to make significant installations during 2015, and China's just passed the 1 gigawatt market, and we're still waiting for the offshore market in China to take off. We would expect it anytime soon, but we've been saying that for several years, so we'll wait and see. And of course, we'll have the U.S. on the board by this time next year with the 30 megawatt wind farm off of the coast of Rhode Island. Looking ahead, our rolling projections, 5-year projections, again, we didn't anticipate 22% growth in 2015. We expected that there would be rather modest growth. I think we were off by about 8 gigawatts, 8 or 9 gigawatts, and most of that could be accounted for by the fact that while China installed 23 gigawatts in 2014, nobody expected them to go much, if any, higher than that in 2015, but in fact they ended up at 30. Also, the U.S. market was about 2 gigawatts larger than I expected it to be in 2015. So looking forward, we'll see that markets start to pick up again, growing from 63 to 64 next year, breaking 70 gigawatts per year in 2018 and getting close to 80 by 2020, where the global cumulative installed capacity should be getting close to about 800 gigawatts in total. If you look at the cumulative market forecast by region, this is pretty much how it shakes out, with Asia again, largely China plus India, but with a bunch of new markets coming forward, leading the pack. North America in third place, and Europe marching steadily towards its 2020 targets. And this is how it would look in terms of the annual market, at least as far as the projections are concerned. Now, these all look like very nice, smooth, rational, growth-related charts. Reality will always be different. Hopefully they will balance out, and we've put the right sort of parameters in there, but we get a chance to check that in a very public fashion once every year. And I should just say well, anyway, I won't say that because we want to get to the main event. This is our longer-term forecast, and this is where we sit now in terms of where we would have expected to be in terms of the global wind energy outlook scenario, somewhere between 700 and 800 gigawatts by 2020. During that period from 2009 to 2013, when the market was flat, we fell off of the advanced scenario track down to the moderate scenario track and actually a bit below it. But for the last 2 years now, we've been back on the advanced scenario track, and in fact, just slightly ahead of it. So we could end up at that 800 gigawatts by 2020, which is really the long-term target, which will be somewhere between 8 and 9% of global electricity supply. Okay, looking at new markets, for the last several years we've been largely occupied with these three: Brazil, Mexico, and South Africa. They're all pretty well established now, although Mexico is still wrestling with the energy reform and getting the new system embedded. And South Africa has its own problems in terms of the governance of the country, as does Brazil. But in all cases, I would say that despite the political travails, at least so far, the wind industry is more or less immune. Well, not immune, but not very negatively affected, at least not yet. If you look at the rest of Africa, it's a real growth everywhere. Big tender awards in both Egypt and Morocco last year. Ethiopia is the fourth market, I guess, after South Africa, Morocco, and Egypt. And they're in the process of moving into a privatization of their electricity sector and allowing IPPs in for the first time, which should result in substantial growth in that market, which has some of the best wind resources in Africa. Big projects in Ghana and Kenya and Tanzania. Well, the first wind turbines of the famous Lake Turkana project, which will be the largest one in Africa once it's completed, the largest single project. They are now up and running. We hope the rest of that project gets built out during the course of the rest of this year. If you look at Asia, we've got a number of smaller markets. I mean, Asia outside of China and India, which are, of course, the main ones. Mongolia is moving ahead, Vietnam, the Philippines. The two new entries, which I think are very interesting, are Indonesia and Iran. Indonesia signed the first wind PPAs just during the course of 2015. And it's a potentially very large market, which is only really available to us now with modern turbine technology dealing with lower wind speeds. And Iran, of course, which has tremendous wind speeds, tremendous wind resources. It has desperate need to diversify their economy and to reduce air pollution in their major cities. Little political problem with them, but it seems to be at least moving in the right direction at the moment. So there's a lot of interest in that market. And then elsewhere in South America, of course, Uruguay, which will by the end of this year or early next year have 40% of its electricity from wind. Chile, which has evolved into a relatively stable, if modest, market. And then the latest new one, of course, is Argentina, with a new government there and their re-entry into the global financial community through coming to a settlement with the holdouts in New York. They're able to raise money on international capital markets and rejoin the global economic community. And the new government has great plans for renewable energy. So I will just sum up there. And basically this is what I said. The other statistic that emerged actually from the IEA's analysis of the global electricity markets when looking at emissions was the fact that of all new power generation, in other words, net new generation by technology in 2015, about half of it was from wind, so more than any other single technology, which is the first time that that's ever happened. We have 26 markets with more than a gigawatt, 8 with more than 10, a proliferation of new markets around the world. And yeah, about 4% of global electricity supply, should be 6 to 8% or maybe a little bit more by 2020, and a lot more than that down the road if we're going to get to grips with the climate problem. But that's a conversation for another day. So I will wrap it up there and hand it over to my colleague, John Hensley, who, as Tammy mentioned, is the Manager of Industry Data and Analysis at the American Wind Energy Association. And John, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you to Renewable Energy World and GWEC for putting on this webinar. It's an honor to be able to present on the U.S. market for the audience. And to get things started, I like to do polls during a lot of my presentations. And so I've got a poll just to get a better sense of the audience and what folks' current participation level is in the U.S. market. So a brief poll to see, kind of on a roaming scale, what is your current involvement in the U.S. wind market? And I'll leave this up for 30 seconds or so to get sufficient feedback from folks. And just give a little bit of brief introduction to myself and AWEA. So as Steve said, I'm the Manager of Industry Data and Analysis at AWEA. American Wind Energy Association is a trade association focused on the U.S. market. My team in particular is focused on pulling together market research and reports to help guide our membership and also to help inform the policy conversations that are going on about wind. Today I'm going to cover quite a bit of ground during my presentation. It's obviously a pretty expansive topic. I'm going to look at the current base of installations in the United States, look at wind installations compared to other technology sources, give folks a sense of where deployment is happening around the country. I'll look at some of the technology improvements that we've seen in the U.S. market, look at costs. The big story there, costs are falling in the U.S. in particular. Look at some of the policies, especially the PTC and the impact that the 5-year extension of the PTC is having on the market, as well as renewable portfolio standards and clean power plan issues. I'll wrap up looking at a couple of barriers and then present some info on upcoming events that OWEA is hosting. So hopefully folks were able to see the poll. There we go. Pull this up for everybody. So a good mix of folks involved in the U.S. industry, a lot of folks looking to enter the U.S. market. I think this will be a helpful presentation to give you a little better sense of the landscape in the U.S. And then for those of you not in the market nor considering entering the market, perhaps I can change your mind, or perhaps you'll just have a better sense of how the market is working. So as Steve said, 2015 was a very strong year, not only globally for the U.S. for the wind industry, but also for the U.S. industry. 2015 was our third most active year on record. We installed approximately 8.6 gigawatts, beat out only by the years 2012 and 2009. From 2014 to 2015, we saw approximately 20% growth in the market. And as you can see here, the U.S. wind industry has sort of grown exponentially over the years. In our first 28 years of being an industry, it took about 28 years for the industry to install its first 35 gigawatts. We've doubled that amount just within the last 6 years, so very strong growth over time. Obviously, there have been some ups and downs due to some of the policy uncertainty that we've seen with various expirations of the production tax credit, but hopefully some of those have been alleviated with recent legislation. In terms of new power capacity added to the U.S. electricity system in 2015, wind was the #1 new source. We provided 41% of all new capacity additions. Solar followed in second at about 28%, as well as gas at a similar 28%. But I think it's more important to consider what has been happening over a number of years. And you can see here the 5-year average wind installation captures about 30% of the market, second only to natural gas. So we've become kind of a predominant player in new installation mix within the United States. And I think it's even more important to focus on where we're seeing these installations regionally and what kind of market share does wind have in various regions throughout the country. It's so the Southeast, an area that doesn't have great wind resource and has a strong reliance on coal and natural gas. Obviously not seeing a lot of wind power installations in that area, but in more of the wind belt regions of the country, including the Midwest, the Northwest, Plain States, and Texas, we're seeing very robust growth in those markets and seeing wind capture a majority of the new power installations in those markets. You can see that in at least 3 of those markets, the Midwest, the Northwest, and the Plain States, we're capturing approximately 60% or more of new installations over the last 5 years. And then in Texas, a state that has been dominated by a lot of natural gas build out, we are actually the largest new source of power generating capacity in that state over the last 5 years. Not a majority, but we're still the largest new source. And then if you throw solar into the mix and kind of get a overall renewable market share in the markets of California, the Mountain West, and New England states were actually combined over 50% of new additions in those markets. We'll drill down a little bit closer and see what's happening at the state level. So with the 8.6 gigawatts that were installed in 2015, the market is now roughly 74 gigawatts of new installed or cumulative installed capacity across the U.S., quickly approaching that 75 gigawatt benchmark. In 2015, of course, we passed the 70 gigawatt benchmark. Texas is the leading state in the U.S. market, has been for a number of years, has more than double the installed capacity of any other state. Iowa sits in second place with roughly 6 gigawatts. California falls in third, and I think soon to be passed by Oklahoma in fourth place. Illinois, with close to 4 gigawatts, sits in fifth. Texas, in recent years, has continued to be the market leader. We installed almost 3.5 gigawatts of new installations in 2015. Oklahoma following quickly on Texas's heels with more than 1.4 gigawatts installed last year. So we're seeing strong growth in those markets as well. I think it's not only important to look at how much capacity we have installed in the ground, but also to get a sense of how much wind generation we're receiving from the turbines that are deployed. And this map gives you a good indication of the market share of wind in the state's electricity generation portfolio. Across the United States, wind generated 4.7% of total electricity in 2015. But of course, you can see that in some of the heavier wind states, we're seeing substantially more wind market share. Iowa, which is the national leader, gets more than 31% of its electricity from wind energy. Kansas and South Dakota, both above 20%. And we have more than 12 states that are generating 10% or more of their electricity from wind. So we're certainly starting to see wind penetrate the U.S. market in a big way. Looking a little bit forward, we've seen what the past installations have been. Let's look a little bit into the future and see what capacity we expect to come online in the next couple of years. One way we do this is looking at under construction activity. And as of the end of the first quarter of 2016, we have more than 10 gigawatts of wind projects under construction across the country. There's a heavy concentration in the Texas market. As you can see, more than half of the under construction activity is in that state. Plain states, Oklahoma, Kansas are kind of the second area of major development. But it's important to note that it's not just happening in kind of that wind belt region from Texas up through the Dakotas. We also see significant under construction activity in the Great Lakes area, including Michigan, and also in the New England states, primarily in the state of Maine. Maine was actually our fastest growing state in 2015, and we continue to see strong under construction activity in that state, which has become kind of a vessel for renewable energy development in the region. If we look a little bit further too, we also track projects that are under development. So these are projects that have secured a turbine order. A utility has announced that they're going to build a project, or we've seen a power purchase agreement signed. And in this category, we see a further 5 gigawatts of projects that we expect to come online in the next couple of years. So in total, around 15 gigawatts, and we expect these to come online in the next year to 2 years. And with that, we'll turn our attention to who is actually purchasing this wind power. Obviously, once you get in the ground, you still have to have someone offtake the electricity and deliver it to market. The biggest buyer of wind power, of course, is utilities, and it depends what the purchasing mechanism is. The preferred purchasing mechanism is depending on the market that you're looking at. Most of the utilities prefer to offtake with a long-term power purchase agreement. As you can see in 2015, roughly 60% of projects that came online had a long-term PPA attached to them. Some utilities do prefer to own their own generation, their own wind generation, kind of keeping in line with the traditional model. We saw about a gigawatt worth of wind power that was directly owned by utilities. And then kind of diverting from the long-term contracting model, there are a variety of projects that actually supply directly into the merchant market, into the real-time or day-ahead markets, or have some sort of quasi-merchant agreement set up. In a lot of cases, these quasi-merchant projects include a hedge on their production. Most of this activity is limited to the Texas region, primarily in ERCOT, but it is a significant piece of the power contracts that we're seeing. In terms of the biggest players on the utility front, you can see here that these are the top 10 electric utilities that have wind power on their system, either secured through a power purchase agreement or directly owned by the utility. Xcel Energy, which is a utility that operates in Minnesota, Colorado, and a variety of other states, has been our largest utility in terms of wind capacity for the last 12 years. Berkshire Hathaway, sort of a new addition to the list in the last couple of years, but as you can see, quickly rising into the number 2 position. This includes the utility Mid-American, which, if folks have been following the U.S. market closely, you saw that they announced a 2-gigawatt project in Iowa in the last month or so, so we continue to expect them to grow out their wind system as well. If you look at the top 10 electric utilities, 26% of the projects are being sold to these 10 utilities. The top 20 take about 45% of the wind power that's being sold. We do see some participation from electric cooperatives and public utilities, especially some of the municipalities. Austin Energy in Texas, or CPS, buying a lot of wind power to deliver to their local customers. We're also seeing a growing trend from non-utility purchasers. So the corporations and other kind of emerging energy purchasers are starting to play a substantial role in the U.S. market. Last year, we saw 52% of the megawatts contracted through PPAs going to these non-utility purchasers. This is certainly a market that's been growing exponentially, especially in the last 3 or 4 years. Companies like Google and Facebook, Dow Chemical, Walmart are all finding value in the low-cost, fixed-price nature of wind power and are looking to secure this energy source for not only because of its low cost, but also because of its clean air attributes as they try to meet some of their corporate responsibility goals. If we look kind of all time at non-utility activity, we've seen more than 4.5 gigawatts of PPAs signed by these entities. And we certainly expect this trend to continue. We've already seen in the first quarter of 2016 and even the last couple of months, new PPAs being signed by the likes of Google and others as they continue to try to secure wind power. One that I'll mention here just to call out is Amazon Web Services. They've done a couple of projects already. One of note is a new project in the southeast. They're building, or I guess buying the power from a project that is being built in North Carolina, a state not typically associated with wind power projects. This will actually be their first utility scale project. But it signals kind of another new purchaser of wind power that we've seen in the last couple of years, and that's southeastern utilities. We have seen a number of utilities in the southeast that are finding value in contracting for wind that's in primarily the Plains states and then delivering that electricity into the south. So another growing market area there as well. Shift gears a little bit and walk through some of the technology advancements that we've seen in the U.S. wind industry. So one stat that we always like to throw around is that the cost of wind energy has fallen by 66% since 2009. And a large reason that this cost has been able to be driven down is by technology advancements. As you can see here, the average wind turbine that's deployed in the U.S. has changed pretty tremendously over the last 10 or 15 years. Back in 2000, the average hub height of a machine was only 58 meters, and the rotor diameter was only 49 meters. Fast forward to 2015, the average hub height was 82 meters, and the rotor diameter more than 100 meters. So we've seen these wind turbines grow in height and also in their rotor diameter to enable them to capture more of the wind energy resource that's in the area. This has not only opened up new areas for development, but it's also made these machines quite a bit more efficient in capturing and harnessing the wind energy resource that we see in the areas. In terms of the major players on the turbine manufacturing end in the U.S., we are a market that's dominated primarily by three main players: GE Renewable Energy, Vestas, and Siemens. In 2015, they captured roughly 88% of the market. In other recent years, 2013 and 2014, they were actually more than 98% of the market, so a large dominance by these three main players. We do see a couple of French players, including Gamesa, Nordex, and Acciona, who also play in the U.S. market, but we tend to be dominated by those three main players. Here's a good look at project deployment by hub height, and I'll draw your attention to the orange circles. These represent wind turbines that have a hub height over 100 meters. As you can see, these are opening up new areas of development across the United States. We've seen a large use of these machines in the Great Lakes region, the Mid-Atlantic, and the New England states, areas that at lower hub heights don't have as good of wind resource, but as you move up into that 100-meter area, you're able to make these projects much more economical and efficient. And if we turn our attention to rotor diameters, we see kind of a much larger dispersion of the 100-meter plus rotor diameter machines across the United States. We've seen a real trend in driving down the specific power rating of machines, which is basically the watts per rotor swept area of the machine. These are helping to drive up capacity factors across the U.S. and essentially generate more electricity per given megawatt of installed capacity. We expect this trend to continue substantially over the years. Obviously, Europe has done a little more with the larger rotor diameters, even taller hub heights. We expect the U.S. market to move in a similar direction. And this next map will pretty much indicate why. So these are wind resource potential maps at different hub heights that put together by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory here in the U.S. On the left-hand side, we have hub heights of 80 meters and the wind resource associated with that hub height. And on the right, you can see the wind resource potential at 110 meters. The 110 meters certainly open up a lot of new areas to wind development across the country. You can see large portions of the southeast are open, including, or in addition, large parts of New England states that the developers have kind of shied away from with some of the older technology. But as we see wind turbine technology continue to grow, we'll certainly see a lot more development in these particular regions that are made accessible. I'll quickly jump into the manufacturing footprint in the U.S. So this map just depicts all of the wind-related manufacturing facilities that are deployed across the U.S. We've got over 500 active facilities that employ roughly 21,000 folks. Pretty much every component in the value chain is represented in the U.S., including the large component suppliers. So as I mentioned, GE, Siemens, and Vestas are the large OEM players in the U.S. market, and they each have a domestic manufacturing facility here in the U.S. We also have a large number of blade manufacturers and tower manufacturers that are local here to the U.S. And we see certainly on the larger component end, a majority of the components are domestically manufactured. So a really robust U.S. manufacturing fleet. And it's important to note that despite the lack of wind projects in the Southeast, we do have a strong manufacturing footprint in that area. And also in the Mid-Atlantic states, a large part of the Rust Belt region that sort of saw a lot of this industry fall away has been revitalized to some extent by the ability to supply the wind industry. Now I want to cover costs a little bit, look at cost trends that we've seen over time, and also dive a little bit into the policies that have helped to bring these costs down. So here you can see just a nice depiction of as the technology has increased in size and scale, we've seen costs come down very rapidly. I mentioned not only taller towers, larger rotor diameters driving this, but we've also seen advances in computer analytics, networked sensors, and also the ability to domestically manufacture products for the U.S. market has substantially brought down costs for the industry. And we expect these costs to continue. Like I said, we've seen 66% cost reduction since 2009. And in conversations with a lot of the OEMs that are playing in this marketplace, they expect those cost trajectories to continue to fall. And it's not just about cost when you're considering the levelized cost of energy. It's also advances in performance. So, certainly as the machines advance, they're able to perform at much higher capacity levels, have higher availabilities, and these are all combining to drive down costs in the U.S. market. Compared to natural gas, and the U.S. market is really becoming a three-technology market with a lot of focus on natural gas, certainly a lot of wind deployment, and also a lot of solar deployment. Natural gas obviously been one of the major competitors over a number of years, and we've seen kind of a sustained low natural gas price environment. This trajectory shows that there will be some convergence in the cost of wind and gas generation technology within the next 5 years. Certainly we're starting to see this convergence already happen in many parts of the country. The rapid deployment in Texas is no accident. We're very competitive in that market. Markets like the Plain States and the Midwest, a similar story. So we're already starting to see this convergence happen in parts of the world. If we want to look at unsubsidized levelized cost of energy across technologies, this study from Lazard, kind of a Wall Street financial outfit, is one of the better studies to look at. The area circled in red is the range of LCOE for wind in the United States. You'll see a band running from about $32 to $77 per megawatt hour. The difference in the range is attributable to different regions within the U.S., the complexity of the project, performance factors that are associated with the wind resource in those areas. But you can see that we compare very favorably with a lot of other technologies that are out there, including gas combined cycle, which has a range of about $52 to $76. And these are prices as of 2015. So you can see that the U.S. is increasingly becoming very competitive with other technologies. All right, let's shift our focus and dial in a little bit on the production tax credit, which has been the main federal policy mechanism for the U.S. wind industry over a number of years. This chart shows the impact of PTC expirations on the U.S. wind industry. The last time the tax credit was allowed to expire was back in 2012, the year in which we built about 13 gigawatts, and then in 2013 we only built 1 gigawatt. So a fairly robust impact on the wind industry for not having long-term policy stability. However, at the end of 2015, we did receive what we've been asking for a number of years, which was a multi-year extension of the PTC. As Congress passed it, the PTC was extended at 100% value in years 2015 and 2016, 80% value in 2017, 60% value in 2018, and 40% value in 2019. Now, many of you are probably going to ask about the IRS guidelines. We have not seen any indication from IRS what the final guidelines are going to look like. There are indications, I guess, that they'll look similar with the start construction language as what we've seen before. And it's hard to say when those guidelines will come out, but we expect something within the next month or so. So there'll be a little bit more clarity at that point in time. Now, what was the impact of, well, actually, before I get to that, I'd like to throw in another poll question for folks, just to get a sense of what people anticipate the U.S. market doing with the recent extension of the 5-year PTC. And so what's your outlook for the U.S. wind industry through 2020? Give folks a minute to punch in their poll results, and then we'll look at what was the actual impact in terms of megawatt projections that accompanied the PTC extension. Give folks just a few more seconds here. All right, flash these up on the screen so everybody can furiously write down what everybody else is thinking. Seems like there's a convergence around the 25 to 35 gigawatt mark. Very interesting. Some of you are very bullish with more than 40 gigawatts. All right, so what was the actual impact of the PTC? One way that we like to look at this is to review consultant forecasts for wind build out over the next 5 or 6 years. So this chart is a kind of an amalgamation of consultant forecasts through 2021. In this market, the consultant saw, and this particular projection was done sort of early in 2015 before the PTC had been extended, and certainly before there were wide expectations that we would have a multi-year extension. A lot of folks at this point thought it would be just a standard 1-year extension. Cumulatively, or through this 6-year period, the consultants saw about 28 gigawatts of wind build. Of course, they revised their expectations following the extension of the PTC, and with the PTC, they saw more than 44 gigawatts, so at kind of the upper end with those more bullish of you in the audience. This was a net increase of more than 16 gigawatts of new anticipated wind demand that accompanied the extension of the PTC. It's roughly a 7 gigawatt per year market, according to these expectations. So a very robust impact from the PTC extension. Other drivers, aside from the production tax credit on U.S. market growth, come from, one, renewable portfolio standards. We saw kind of a widespread resurgence in the popularity of renewable portfolio standards across the U.S. in 2015. Hawaii, Vermont, and California all increased their RPSs in 2015. California, the most notable, going to a 50% RPS by 2030, mostly because of the scale. Hawaii actually went to 100%, but sort of a smaller electric market out there. And then in 2016, Oregon went to a 50% RPS, and Maryland's legislature has passed an increase to a 25% RPS. So very robust additions or increases in the stringency of RPSs across the U.S. that are going to drive a lot of wind demand. We do our own internal forecasting, or really reconciliation of RPS targets with submitted recs at this point in time, and calculate the remaining demand in these markets. Here you can see a regional breakdown of what we expect. The blue bars on the left represent the full RPS requirement. The middle bar, the white bar, represents wind-eligible RPS compliance. And then we do some adjustments to kind of build an expectation for how much wind we think will actually capture those RPS requirements, and that's indicated by the purple bar to the far right. We see around 40 gigawatts of cumulative wind demand from these RPS markets across all markets in the U.S. The largest markets tend to be the Mid-Atlantic, California, New York, and Northwest. If we drill down into just the next sort of 10-year time period, we expect about 31 gigawatts of wind demand to be driven by renewable portfolio standards through 2025. There are a handful of states that have obligations past the 2025 time period. Some of the states like Oregon, Hawaii have RPSs that continue to grow past the 2025 period, but the good majority of the demand will come within the next decade. The Clean Power Plan is also anticipated to be a large driver of wind energy in the U.S. market. The Clean Power Plan limits CO2 emissions from electricity generators, notably coal and natural gas generation facilities. And EIA, which is our Energy Information Administration here in the U.S., did a study that found that wind will provide the majority of the lowest cost compliance mix for meeting the Clean Power Plan in the U.S., more than 57%. So we certainly do expect to see robust demand and growth from the Clean Power Plan in the U.S. Despite the stay, there's a current litigation and stay on the rule, but we believe that stay will eventually be overturned and the Clean Power Plan will be put into law. Here's just a nice depiction of how that demand will grow over time. We see it growing, or according to the EIA analysis, we see it growing from roughly 191 terawatt hours of wind generation to 311 terawatt hours by 2030. So certainly as the PTC extension fades, we start to see the Clean Power Plan targets pick up and drive a lot of the growth in wind going forward. Some of the barriers to wind development in the U.S. include transmission and siting constraints. On the transmission side, there's certainly a need for large-scale investments in new transmission lines to deliver the wind power from traditionally windy or wind resource-rich parts of the country to the demand centers. Here's just a nice depiction of some proposed projects that are out there that are capable of delivering large quantities of wind from these areas into areas of higher population density. Certainly we'll need large-scale investment and some permitting barriers to be kind of moved along in order to help facilitate a lot of this investment. And it's been shown historically that these new investments in transmission do catalyze a lot of growth in wind. So these are recently completed transmission lines throughout the U.S. that have helped to spur new development of wind power in these regions. Most notably the CREZ projects down in ERCOT. They've driven more than 6.1 gigawatts of wind projects since they've been completed. So we'll certainly need to see large-scale investment in transmission in the country to continue to enable the growth that we've seen over time. Siting concerns are also a major concern for the industry over time. There are a large number of species and regulatory rules and barriers that could potentially dampen wind energy growth. We as an industry have been working side by side with all the regulatory bodies and state officials to ensure that we're having as minimal of an impact on the environment and surrounding ecosystems as possible. And we hope that as we continue to develop, those siting concerns won't preclude us from developing further. The offshore industry in the U.S. is also starting to grow. We actually have our first project under construction in Rhode Island. It's a 30-megawatt project that's due for completion at the end of 2016. And while a large segment of our membership and industry are focused on the onshore market, we do start to see a little bit more traction in the offshore market. There are currently 13 projects, just over 6 gigawatts in total size, that have been proposed off the east, west coast, and also in the Great Lakes region. And then BOEM, our Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, has issued already 11 commercial leases in offshore waters. So we do expect to see some continued activity in the offshore market as we move forward. So that wraps it up for my overview of the U.S. wind market. I'll just leave you with a couple of closing thoughts. The first is Repower, our largest event and the seminal event for the U.S. wind industry market, is later this month, May 23rd through the 26th in New Orleans. Our theme this year is Generation Wind, and if you're interested in the U.S. market, there really is no better event to attend. Pretty much everybody who's in the industry will be there and attending. There's also a list of our upcoming events, including the Repower Conference in New Orleans. If you're in any of these regions or have expertise in some of these topical matters, we do encourage you to attend and lend your insight to the industry. And then just leave you with a moment of zen, a nice project from actually my hometown in Wyoming. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Steve.
Okay, thanks a lot, John. A lot of information there, a lot of information. We have some time for some questions. I have a couple here from Mr. Botello from EDP. The first one about non-utility PPAs, in other words, primarily corporate purchasers, but also municipal and others. How big of a role is that starting to play in the U.S. market, and where do you think it's going to go?
So as I mentioned before, it's already starting to play a large role in the U.S. market. We saw 52% of PPAs, of the megawatts contracted through PPAs in 2015, go to these non-utility purchasers. But certainly, utilities are still continuing to play the largest role in the U.S. market. They continue to purchase the majority of the wind power that we're seeing come online. But I do think we'll continue to see these non-utility entities contract for more and more wind power, especially, some of the companies that I mentioned, the Googles, the Amazons, the Walmarts of the world. There's certainly some of the larger organizations, but if you look at the full Fortune 500 company list, we're only starting to scratch the surface of the companies that are capable and have the energy needs that sort of incentivize this type of large-scale purchase of energy. And as we see more and more customers demand kind of the corporate responsibility and environmental attributes that wind power provides, we think that market will continue to grow.
Okay. Now the questions are coming in droves. Mr. Larry Rose from Lair & Logan LLC asks about capacity factor of U.S. wind turbines. Do you know what the average capacity factor is across the U.S.?
Yeah, great question. We've done quite a bit of work looking at capacity factors in the U.S. in our annual market report. And it's interesting, in 2015, if you look across the entire fleet, capacity factor was about 32%. But I don't think that tells the full story, because we've got a lot of old turbines that were built in the 80s and early 90s that are continuing to operate that certainly bring that average capacity factor down. So one thing that we do is we like to look at capacity factors by vintage year, the year in which the project was commissioned. And if you look at 2013 and 2014, really the vintage years that we have enough information for to start gleaning some information, we see the average capacity factors in 2015 for those vintage years was up around 39–40%. And this compares with somewhere around 30 to 35% for some of the 2012, 2011, 2010 vintage years. So as the technology continues to improve, we are seeing these gains in capacity factors.
But you're certainly head and shoulders above most of the other large markets in terms of your average capacity factors. There are markets with higher ones, Brazil or South Africa or Mexico, but of the established markets, certainly the European ones and China and India, you're well ahead of the game already. So,
sure. And I'll just,
go ahead.
Sure. I'll just mention, you were showing the China numbers earlier, and they've got, I think more than double the installed capacity of the U.S. But in 2015, the U.S. market actually generated more megawatt hours than the Chinese market. Of course, a lot of the issues in China have to do with curtailment and kind of some take-or-pay contracts on the coal side, but we're still seeing some high productivity from our machines.
That is true, although there was 39 terawatt hours of wind curtailed in China last year, which would have put it well ahead of the U.S. But still, no, I mean, the U.S. industry is very efficient overall and produces a lot of bang for the megawatt. Don't have a lot of time yet. There's 3 questions around the PTC. One is about date. You already mentioned you're not sure, but do you think the next month? And the second question is, will the PTC apply to repowering projects, assuming that those start to become a factor? And finally, is that what would you say at the end of 2019 or the beginning of 2020 when the PTC is phased out, what would you think the prospects for the market are, assuming that the Clean Power Plan does not go ahead? Do you think there'll be some attempt to revitalize the PTC, or do you think then just wind is on its own? So,
sure. I'll cover those
timing
in order. So,
yeah.
In terms of the PTC IRS guidelines, we expect something to come out at the end of this month. Of course, there were some expectations for the guidance to be released at sometime in April, so it's not a firm deadline, but every indication that we've heard from some of the conversations we've had with IRS indicate that by the end of the month we'll have some more clarity on the IRS rules surrounding the PTC. I'm trying to think. What was the second part of that question, Steve?
Repowering.
Repowering.
The PTC.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think it depends on the definitional issue of repowering. If you're completely decommissioning the project and starting a brand new project from scratch, then certainly as long as you meet the deadlines for compliance or for compliance with the PTC, you'll certainly it would seem that you'd be eligible for the PTC. In terms of retrofitting a project, you would need to seek a little bit further clarity from, I guess, your legal team on how you would comply. So it sort of depends on the actual definition of what you're doing on those projects. And then in terms of an outlook, what happens in those years as the PTC phases down and for whatever reason, if there is a stay of the Clean Power Plan, there still will be growth in the U.S. wind industry. It may not be the 7 to 8 gigawatts a year that we expect over the next couple of years, but we continue as an industry to drive down costs. As I mentioned, 66% in the last 6 years, and every indication that we have is that those costs will continue to fall. We become increasingly competitive with natural gas. And, even in those periods of lack of federal incentives or support, we would anticipate still fairly robust demand for wind.
Okay. Last question. We're just about out of time. We have a number of people wanting to know what your prospect is in terms of the competition with solar. Do you expect solar to pass wind in terms of annual installations, either this year or in general? And what about in cumulative terms? Do you think that is solar serious competition?
Yeah, so we've certainly in the last couple of years seen solar really rise to prominence. I think in 2014 they actually installed more capacity than wind did. Of course, we regained the lead in 2015, but we certainly see some healthy competition from the solar folks. I think in a lot of ways it depends on what markets you're looking at. Solar has grown fairly rapidly in California and has been the leading new resource in that market for a couple of years now. I think some favorable siting conditions in addition to just the tremendous solar resource that's available in that state has driven a lot of that. But if you look at states that tend to be wind resource heavy states, we continue to see a dominance by wind in those markets. Think of the upper Midwest states, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Iowa, on down through Kansas and Oklahoma, even Texas. So I think, solar will certainly continue to bring their costs down and continue to become more competitive with wind over time. Our industry will do the same, and I think you'll start to see a little bit of regional carve-out where solar focuses on the southeast and parts of the southwest, and wind plays a more prominent role in other markets.
Well, good. That's a similar sort of answer that I would give if you look at the global market, which is obviously more complex. But it will vary by region, it will vary by demand profile, which of course will impact not only the utility of the usefulness of the relative technologies, but also its cost. So I think the one thing that's clear is that the electricity markets of the future are going to be dominated by wind and solar, but who's bigger in which places will depend on a complexity of factors. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thanks very much, John. Thank you to Renewable Energy World, and thank you to all of you who dialed in for this call, and we hope to see as many of you as possible later on this month down in New Orleans at the American Wind Energy Association's Wind Power Show, Conference and Exhibition. So with that, Tammy, I'll hand it back to you, and thanks everyone again for dialing in.
Thanks, Steve. On behalf of RenewableEnergyWorld.com and Penwell Corporation, I want to thank today's speakers, Steve Sawyer and John Hensley, for today's presentation, GWEC Presents Webcast on Wind, Doing Business in the United States. This presentation will be archived within 24 hours and can be reached from the homepage at RenewableEnergyWorld.com. A reminder email message for the archive will be sent to all registrants, complete with a direct link to the archive. Don't forget, the archive will also contain PDFs of today's presentation, so do come back in and at least grab those. We thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to bringing you more webcasts here in the near future. Goodbye.